You are watching Talks About Future, and I am Mark Grigorian. My guest today is Ronald Grigor Suny, Professor of History and Political Science of the University of Michigan, Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History of the University of Chicago. And we will be talking about the genocide. I think no other public conversation would be relevant at the end of April when we all remember the dreadful events of 1915. Uh, Ron, uh, today the American press is full of reports that Biden is planning to recognize the Armenian genocide. What will it change?
Mark, it's a great pleasure to be with Очень приятно с вами разговаривать. It's really a pleasure. I love seeing you, and I think of you as one of the major intellectual voices that we have. And so it's a pleasure to answer your questions. I think it's very important. I think this is a turning point. Now, clearly in politics, there are moments of significance and there are moments of symbolic significance. This is a moment of symbolic significance, but symbolic significance can also have real world effects. And I think this is one of them. Think of all the struggles that went on for all those years with American presidents, every candidate promising in the campaign that they would recognize the genocide, only to refuse to do that for strategic reasons, particularly during the Cold War. And then after the Cold War, because Turkey was still a member of NATO and a strategic ally against what they were thinking of as a resurgent Russia, right? So the fact that Biden would change that equation, in fact, means that the American relationship with Turkey is changing. Biden is no fan of Erdogan. In fact, they have had quite a few clashes over the years, humiliations, events, harsh discussions. All of those things are important. And then when Erdogan visited Washington a few years ago, and in fact humiliated Americans because of the way his bodyguards treated Kurdish and Armenian demonstrators, I think that was also a turning point. Public opinion in America turned very sharply against, in a kind of the popular imagination, against Turkey. Now, this moment then, and then of course the terrible tragedy that befell Armenia last year with the defeat in the war over Karabakh, I think has changed the calculation in Washington. And this can be a moment of opening. We'll see, but it seems to me it's a hopeful moment.
Aren't you now talking as an American or an American Armenian? Because for us in Yerevan, what will change if the American and Turkish relations change? How can it affect Armenians, you name it, in Armenia, in Russia, in Singapore, or in Uruguay?
Well, I do speak as an American and an American Armenian. That's what I am. I was born in the United States, but I was raised, in that peculiar nexus, that peculiar intermediate zone where you're Armenian and American. But I obviously identify with this country, and though I'm a critic of much of its policies over the years, still I speak from this point of view. My sense is that at the moment, there's no power in the world with the wealth and military effect of the United States. We saw both in the Trump years and now in the Biden years that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, as they said, right? That is, the effect is enormous, both because America still maintains somehow a kind of moral, political posture in the world. It is the leading, supposedly, not so much during Trump, defender of democracy and so forth. It self-styles itself as the leader of the so-called free world. So all of those things are extraordinarily important. If the United States becomes more critical of Turkey, if it in fact puts pressure on a very reluctant Erdogan to change its policies. That can have a very good effect on Armenia and on the South Caucasus in general. Erdogan is at the moment very weak. The economy is very bad in Turkey. His popularity has declined. In my own context with Turkey, I write a monthly column for Agos, the Hrant Dink's newspaper in Istanbul. It's very clear that the mood in the country is changing. Of course, he's now established himself as a kind of authoritarian leader, not unlike Putin, in fact, much more ruthless than Putin, I would say. And it's going to be hard to, in fact, overthrow him in any sense. But there are elections. And if his popularity, in fact, is declining, and there's a change, even a split in his own party, the AKP, there will be a significant change. And that will be good for Armenia.
Now, what we are talking about, I mean, from your analysis, I see that Armenia and Armenians should prepare for new relations with Turkey post-Erdogan era.
I think that's correct. I think we can begin to think about that. Don't rush into it, because you have to deal with politics as they exist at the moment, not as they exist in some imagined future, right? So one has to wait for the results of the elections that will be forthcoming and so forth. And the problem with Turkey today, as with Russia, is there's no effective opposition. That is, the leaders of those two countries, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, simply do not face open and effective political opposition. The opposition in Russia is in jail, in prison, in Navalny. People are out on the streets, which is a very good thing. They are resisting the authoritarian rule of Putin. But in Turkey, the leaders of the most important opposition, the HDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, are in jail as well. So we don't have an effective opposition, but there's a peculiar system in these two countries. Some call it hybrid authoritarianism, right? It's not democratic, but they actually have elections. And there are people who are allowed to organize in those elections, even though everything, the money, the publicity, the media favors the incumbent, right? So it's very different from, say, American democracy, kind of a bourgeois democracy as we have in America, where money plays a huge role and people of property and power and privilege play a huge role. But still, the incumbent can be overthrown or dismissed, as happened in 2020, and a new government can come to power. So one has to be patient and wait. But I think it's very bad if Armenians, because of the despair they have experienced in the last year, if they become pessimistic or cynical about politics. Armenia did something brilliant a few years ago in 2018. It became a light in the world. It was one of the few places on our globe where a democratic revolution actually occurred. And we had a democratically elected government that overthrew the mafia-like oligarchs who had ruled the country for so long. That was an extraordinary event. Now Armenians are worried. They're calling Pashinyan Davajan. I've been called Davajan. In fact, it's kind of an honor sometimes to be called Davajan, I guess, in such a situation. And they're impatient and don't want to wait for the next democratic choice to take place, which would be a mistake.
Well, Pashinyan Davajan was about a completely different story. And with the lack of opposition, we also have our own problems here.
Absolutely.
But what I would like to say now, to talk now, is not what divides us, but something that unites all Armenians all over the world, wherever the Armenians are, is the necessity of recognition of the genocide. Can we say that it's a national idea for us?
There is no way, Mark, to escape what happened to Armenians 106 years ago. That is, I wrote a book about this. They can live in the desert but nowhere else, A History of the Armenian Genocide. It's translated into Turkish, by the way, Ancak çölde yaşayabilirler, but not into Armenian. I wish it were translated into Armenian. And there's no way to escape that experience. That is a nation that had existed for millennia in what is now Eastern Turkey, historic Armenia, was almost annihilated. We know that it survived, that eventually it became a Soviet republic, and eventually that was the base of the new independent Armenian Republic. So that experience cannot be forgotten or eliminated. But I would say this: what happens to a nation when its major uniting image is of annihilation, is of destruction, rather than the history that occurred after that period? You know, I'm one of those people who studied from an early time the history of Soviet Armenia. Now, that history is tragic in many ways, and by the way, heroic in many ways. The country that you're living in right now was made in those 70 plus years of Soviet history, right? With all the horrors of Stalinism and collectivization, the sacrifices of the Second World War, and so forth. A new Armenia emerged based on its history, its horrific experiences, and its optimism about the possibility of building a new future. That history also has to be recognized. That is, all during the years of the Cold War, whatever happened to the Armenians in 1915, 1916, all those years of the Cold War and of the Soviet period, Armenians were divided, seriously divided, across the globe. There were those Armenians in Hayastan and in the diaspora, a few, like my grandfather, who defended Soviet Armenia. They saw it as the future. But the great majority of the diaspora, in many places led by the ARF, the Dashnang Suchun, was opposed to Soviet Armenia. So we were divided, seriously. In some families, there was not even the recognition that there was an Armenia for those 70 years, right? And only after the end of the Soviet Union and the collapse of that state and the creation of independent Republic of Armenia, was there the possibility that Armenians across the globe could have a single vision based in Hayastan. Now, you and I know the history of this well, and in fact, that kind of unity has been elusive. It has not occurred. That is, there's division still between the genocide, between the diaspora and the Hayastansis. That is part of the facts of our existence. Armenians are a nation, a transnational nation. They have two parts. They have two hearts. One is in the diaspora, okay, Los Angeles, maybe Marseille, Paris, wherever. And the other is in Yerevan and around Mount Ararat. So we are still that divided nation. I would like to look to the future and see if we cannot find other symbolic moments, some other images beside genocide and a kind of lachrymose, weeping history to think about the future. That's what I think we need to do. And by the way, from my conversations with young Armenians in Yerevan and elsewhere, I find they're already doing that. That is, they're looking beyond that history, that not to forget it. No one will forget it. And and our campaign to recognize it will continue. But they're ready to move on. I don't know if you feel that way or you find that evidence, but I certainly have found that.
I have to say that, especially after the war, after the Second Karabakh War, the level of nationalism has gone up. And with the level of nationalism that when we are moving that up, there is such a, entrenched psychology now here in Yerevan, saying that, Armenians are those who are against the Turks, and Armenians are basically the victims of the Turks. Turks meaning both Turks of Turkey and Turks of Azerbaijan. And I think that in a certain element of it brings negativity because if we are sort of losing, we're putting ourselves in a very awkward position, because to describe who are Armenians, we are describing ourselves through Turks. And I don't think it's a very good thing for the future. And, it's all turned into the past. Yet, let me reiterate again that, of course, the world should recognize the genocide. There is no doubt in it. But the way that we are looking on it, I believe there should be other ways of doing that.
I couldn't agree more. I agree absolutely. Armenia's future is best guaranteed by democracy within Armenia, and hopefully, by extension, democracy in Azerbaijan. I know that's almost a utopian idea, and democracy in Turkey. If you think about Hrant Dink, our hero, who was murdered in 2007, January, Hrant always said, recognition of the genocide is less important than the creation of a real democracy in Turkey. Because if there's a real democracy in Turkey, genocide will be recognized automatically. That is, Turks will learn that they have to change their own idea about their foundational myth. The foundational myth of the Turkish state is that it defended itself against domestic and foreign enemies. The so-called Kurtuluş Savaşı, the War of Liberation, was directed against Greek invaders, Armenian invaders, the Allied powers in Istanbul, etc. In that national mythology, the founding mythology of the Turkish Republic, Kemal and his followers, in fact, refused to recognize, except very incidentally, that Kurtuluş Savaşı, that War of Liberation, was preceded by a violent genocidal removal of huge numbers of people, more than 1 million, right, people, the absolute evacuation, deportation, mass killing, and forced assimilation of what can be considered the nascent bourgeoisie, the growing entrepreneurial class, first of Armenians and then later of Greeks. In fact, I'll use a Marxist phrase here. The genocide has to be recognized as what Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital. But this was the most primitive accumulation of capital you can imagine. The Turks basically killed everyone and stole everything, and created by that doing their own native bourgeoisie. Now imagine, how are you going to question that foundational moment, the actual events on which Turkey was founded? How are you going to recognize that and accept it as legitimate? Because it's based on theft and mass murder. You can imagine, Mark, how difficult that would be. Americans have their own problem trying to deal with the genocide of American Indians, of the native peoples of the continent, right? And many of the atrocities that we have committed in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc. It's hard for a country, even a great power. The Russians still cannot deal with the crimes of Stalin, right? That have also affected Armenians. We have to live with that legacy too. And you can imagine how difficult that would be for the Turks. Now, what I think Armenians could do in the future is recognize the complex history of those foundational events, of what happened in the genocide on both sides, right? I'll tell you my line, what I say in my book. I say, the Turks are not monsters. They did monstrous things. And there were many people, popular people, ordinary people who participated, along with Kurds, in the murders of Armenians. But we don't, in fact, say this is the essential, indelible essence of the Turks. If you do that, then you can never live together with them. Now, that's hard for Armenians to imagine. Think of what just happened in October and November last year with Azerbaijanis. It's hard to imagine them as fellow human beings. But if we don't do that in the future, how will this small little nation in the South Caucasus survive in the future with those neighbors? We almost have no friends.
There is another very interesting thing, because when you're saying about this foundational ideology, I notice, and it would be difficult not to notice, that a part of the Turkish society is feeling free to talk about the genocide. A part of the Turkish society, especially, the high intellectual part of it, is apologizing to Armenians and is trying to find a common basis to move forward. But what's very interesting, in Azerbaijan, the denial of the genocide becomes even a more rigid national idea than it is in Turkey now. So it's another element, and when a part of it is also the notion of one nation, two countries, which is now very sort of actively circulated between Turkey and Azerbaijan. It's difficult to live with these neighbors, isn't it?
It's very difficult. Mark, as you mentioned, I'm a historian. So I look backward in order to figure out what's happening now and what's likely to happen in the future, right? History is our only database. It's the only source we have to find out what human beings did, why they did it, what they are likely to do, and what they're doing at the moment. So I look, and I have written my very first book, The Baku Commune, was about Azerbaijan. My first book was about Azerbaijan. And I've studied Azerbaijan, and when the Karabakh movement occurred in the late 90s, I wrote considerable amounts about Karabakh and the movement in Karabakh in order to understand what is going on. And I want to make just 3 points about Azerbaijan. First of all, Azerbaijan in Soviet times was a fragile nation with a very thin national ideology. Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis were caught between different identities, none of which were very solid. Shiite Islam, it wasn't so important. It was there, but it was suppressed under the Soviets. Their connection with Anatolian Turks, right? Again, very difficult in Soviet times. And their history, which was hard for them to recognize, that they were largely a creation of the Soviet period. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't peoples who we call Azerbaijanis, who the Russians called Tatars, Kavkazskiy Tatari, in pre-Soviet times, who did live there and lived there for centuries, along with Armenians and others, right? But as a nation, Azerbaijan, like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, etc., was made in the Soviet period, right? But its nationalism, its sense of national identity, its sense of national coherence was quite weak and divided during the Soviet period. The second point I want to make, that's a long point, but the second point is, where did their nationalism come from? It came from the Karabakh conflict, the defeats they suffered during the Karabakh conflict up to 1994, and it was what you can call Azerbaijani nationalism was what you can call a reactive nationalism.
Which means we actually gave birth to that nation.
Exactly right. In the same way that Israelis gave birth to Palestinian nationalism. Of course, there were some roots and so forth, but it was something that was generated and shaped in that conflict, right? And it still remained fragile. Think of all of the turns that occurred with Elchi Bey and different movements and coming to power until Aliyev began to consolidate the state. There was a weak civil society in Azerbaijan. Civil society, that is the middle classes, etc., were Armenian and Russian, and many of them fled or were driven out of the country. So you got a society in which a rather rabid and quite harsh nationalism directed specifically against Armenians and created by anti-Armenian hostility developed. And we know the events that occurred in Budapest. We know the horrors that Armenians suffered, etc. Why is the war of last year so important? Because for the first time in their modern history, the Azerbaijanis were triumphant. Look how gleeful they are, how much they're celebrating their new victory. This makes the situation with Armenians extraordinarily difficult. You have a triumphant Aliyev consolidating its repressive power on the basis of this new anti-Armenian nationalism, which they are promoting and which is necessary for their survival. And you have a divided, despairing Armenians in Yerevan who are trying to figure out, what are we going to do in the future? How do we shape ourselves beyond hatred for Turks of various kinds?
If you don't mind, I'll just interrupt you here for a second. Because when you say divided Armenians in Yerevan thinking about what we shall do in the future, I believe that's good. I believe when you're discussing your own future and not clinging to your past is a good thing, in fact, because we are trying to construct where we will be in 10 years time or 20 years time. We're trying to understand that, and that's not bad at all, isn't it?
I agree with you, Mark. In fact, one of my mentors, Aram Yengoyan, who was a very fine Armenian anthropologist who worked here at Michigan before he went to California, before he defected to California, Aram said to me, maybe it's good that we're divided. That is, if a country, and my own teacher, Nina Garsoyan, used to say that, if we're all united around one thing, and we always are fighting for unity, then we could all be destroyed at once. But if in fact, Armenian nation is about a discussion, an ongoing dialogue between different peoples, we may not have to yearn so much for some false unity. The unity comes from all of us discussing, who are we? What is our nation? And what is our future? And so sometimes the discussion can become volatile, can become even violent. But that may be, I accept your point, that may be a vital sound. That might be a healthy sign of a nation that's discussing. I will say this, and you know Armenia so much better than I. But when I come to Yerevan, what do I notice? All during the years of what I call the oligarch mafia's rule, during Kocharyan and Sarkisyan and so forth, I know that may be too harsh for some people, but that's what I felt. All during those years of those regimes, civil society in Armenia was alive and well. There was debate. There was a fearlessness. It was hard to believe. We're going to meetings, we're discussing, there's an intelligence that's going on. Okay, it's all colored by a kind of narcissistic nationalism in some ways, but there's a serious discussion. You don't see that in Azerbaijan. There is no civil society. They're in jail, those people, right? So Armenia, for all of its difficulties and divisions, is far healthier a society than Azerbaijan or even Turkey today. And that should be applauded and respected.
Now, coming back to the Armenian-Turkish relations, in fact, there are no diplomatic relations now. The trade relations are almost dead or completely dead at the moment. And in many cases, we believe that there is a precondition. Turkey should recognize the genocide so that we could start, any sort of relations with Turkey. But aren't we making our own lives more difficult by that?
Absolutely, right. That is, I'm not sure what the proper diplomatic road would be out of that dilemma, but you're right to put it in that particular way. There is interest in Turkey, for instance, in the city of Kars. Kars was actually part of Armenian in the Russian Empire from 1878 to 1918, roughly, right? When you go to Kars, and in the old city of Kars, it looks like old Yerevan, the parts of Yerevan that we've destroyed and not preserved, sadly. But I remember it from the 1960s.
When you come back to Armenia, we can travel to Gyumri, and you see the old town that is not destroyed.
Exactly right. The gray basalt buildings, they're there. And when you go to Gyumri and you go to Kars, you see the same kinds of buildings. In that city, people wanted to open the border. They built a monument to freedom because they wanted to They need, Kars, by the way, is the poorest part of Turkey, and they need that open border. The intelligentsia in Turkey is ready to open up to discuss these things, and it was doing so right up to 2015, before the coup against Erdogan, which then closed things down. So there are healthy elements in Turkey that Armenians could ally with and think about, but it's very difficult. I think that making the genocide recognition a precondition, I'm not sure if that's still officially Armenia's policy or not. You'll know better than I. It's gone back and forth through the years, is probably an error. We should open negotiations. We should try through diplomatic means to weaken, undermine the Turkish resistance to making a better relationship with Armenia. We need to do that. Now, the moment is not propitious. At the moment, Erdogan has made a calculation that his best ally is Azerbaijan, and they are using propaganda against Armenians. Imagine, there are 50 or 60,000 Armenians left in Turkey. I'm not discussing the hundreds of thousands of Armenians who are now Islamicized Armenians or Kurds or whatever, but there are those people. They're a vital community with which we should have good relations. I'm thinking of Agos, the Hrant Dink Foundation, wonderful, brave people who are still working and thinking and operating and so forth. And yet Erdogan is targeting those folks as an enemy, as if they're significant in some way, right? Why? This shows how weak his own government is and how weak and fragile his own ideology, that he has to target 50 or 60,000 Armenians in a country of tens of millions as the enemy.
I see. Now, are we ready for the recognition of the genocide? Are we ready?
There has been some literature, and people have written that if the genocide were widely recognized, Armenians would lose, in a sense, their raison d'être. You know, I don't think that's quite correct. I think that if the genocide is recognized, and believe me, we are at a turning point with the Americans about to recognize the genocide officially. Once that happens, we can begin to think about moving beyond that particular step. We can talk about the nature of the genocide. Now, our research and our understanding of the genocide among Armenians, you know, please forgive me for this, is very primitive. Some years ago, I was hoping that the Armenian Genocide Museum, around 2015, would allow us to have a conference in Yerevan about the genocide. We had that conference in 2015 in Istanbul. We had a group called WATS, the Workshop on Armenian Turkish Scholarship, and we brought scholars from all over the world, and we were allowed to do that in Erdogan's Istanbul, just before the coup, of course, the next year. But in Armenia, I was told, no, we're not ready for that. We're not ready for that. In other words, we need to develop, and there are people in Armenian like Harutun Marutian and others who will help develop these things. But we need to think about allying Armenian scholars with Turkish scholars, with Kurdish scholars, with Americans and Germans, etc., to move this scholarship further so that ordinary Armenians know their history better than they do now.
When you say ally with Turkish and Kurdish scholars, you obviously mean, you know, the academic freedom of thought that
Yes.
has to be there, and not the propaganda following the official line.
Yeah, there is an official historiography. It has been defeated largely. It is not taken seriously anywhere in the world. We won that battle. We used to play on the field that the Turks defined. Denial, not denial, denial, denial. That's over. Armenian scholars, along with Turkish, very important, Turkish scholars, Kurdish scholars, American, have defeated the denialist claims. No one takes them seriously except the government of Turkey and in the schools of Turkey, unfortunately, right? Where people are taught a distorted and false history.
Now, I mean, I'm just trying to see where are we Armenians at the moment. And we obviously have our own mythology of the genocide, don't we?
Yes. So when you know, I start my book by talking about the historiographical landscape. What are the views on the genocide of 1915? And of course, at one side, the most reactionary side, it's denial. It didn't happen. There was no genocide. And by the way, the Armenians are to blame for it. They were rebels. They were allied to the Russians, etc. This is a false view. I tried to remind people, and this is something that Armenians are sometimes uncomfortable with. Literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of young Armenian boys were fighting in the Ottoman army against the Russians. Armenians died at the Battle of Sarikamish in December and January 1914, 1915, right? Then they were blamed for the genocide because there were also volunteers from the Caucasian side that were fighting on the other side. But we forget that the Armenian parties, the Dashnags and the Hunchaks, mobilized young Armenians to fight for their country. In other words, many Armenians were loyal Ottoman subjects who wanted to live in the Ottoman Empire, as they had for centuries, and wanted, in fact, more freedom, protection against the Kurds, autonomy of some kind. And this is what the Young Turks refused to do, okay? So there's this denialist literature, and that can be shown to be false. But there's also, on the other side, Armenian myths that we also must fight against. That is, many Armenians don't even try to explain the genocide. Why should you explain it? Babam, Türkeren, they're Turks. That's what Turks do. So they have reduced a complex explanation of events to a kind of culturalist, religious, or racist idea that essentially this is what Turks are. That is no explanation. It is impossible for any serious scholar to take seriously. What you have to do is explain why, at a particular historical moment, at a conjuncture, at the beginning of World War I, a group of young Turks, the most radical, led by Talat Pasha, decided to eliminate the Armenians, right? And we can do that by looking at their mentality, the way they envisioned the world, their idea that the Armenians somehow were an existential threat that would side with the Russians, all of which is false, but which they imagined. And therefore, it was logical, it was rational for them to eliminate the Armenians. Pathologically irrational, of course, but they believed it was rational.
Well, it's not easy, and I know that there will be a lot of opposition to what you said now, because being a victim, why should we put ourselves in the position of perpetrator?
Armenians were not perpetrators at all, and that has to be clearly distinguished, right? Armenians were victims. They were living in what I call in the book a dilemma. There was nowhere to go. Once the Young Turks decided on this policy, right, after January 1913, during the war itself, after Sarikamish, after the loss, then Armenians were victims. And what the Young Turks did was first demobilize the Armenian soldiers, turn them into amele tabulare, that is work battalions, and then murder them. And as I put it in the book, the first thing they did was eliminate the muscle of the Armenian community. So rebellion was therefore off the table. It was impossible. Second, they arrested on April 24th the leading intellectuals, politicians, members of the Turkish parliament even, like Grigor Zorap, and they murdered them. They decapitated the nation. And then all they had were women, children, old people, who they marched to their deaths through the valleys and hills of Turkey into the deserts of Syria, where they then starved them or massacred them. That's the nature of the genocide, right? There's no idea that Armenians were perpetrators. They were victims. But I do try to say they were not without agency of some kind. They were actors in Turkey. They were members of parliament, but they were put in a position where they were made impotent. All the agency then passed to the government, which then decided to murder its own subjects. This is extraordinary, and weaken its own state in order to create a fantastic new Turkey based on Muslim settlers, Turks, and Kurds.
I'm afraid we should stop now because we are talking for more than 40 minutes. It's a very interesting conversation. I believe it is a very thought-provoking conversation. At least I know that you and me were trying to make it thought-provoking. I know that parts of this conversation will have very emotional reaction from the Armenians, from the Turks, and from the Azerbaijanis, if they are listening to us. It's a very difficult subject. It's a subject about atrocities, about victimhood, and about rebirth of our nation. I hope we are facing it. I hope the rebirth is coming pretty soon. We had a couple of questions, but there were more, politically oriented questions, and we almost didn't talk about politics, except a short part of your speech about the Armenian and about the Turkish politics. Thank you very much indeed, Ron. I believe this was a good conversation.
I also believe that, Mark, and thank you for leading me into some of these swampy places where I may lose my way, but hopefully we brought some enlightenment to the discussion, which is complex, but which is absolutely foundational, absolutely fundamental to a better understanding of these complex issues.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.